Right, good afternoon, everyone. I think we're ready to go. This is Michael Weatherburn. I'm the field leader of the Humanities, Social Sciences Education Programme here at Imperial, along with my colleague, Dr. Michael Paraskos, who's here today. We co-convene this research seminar series, principally for staff within the fields of arts, humanities, social science, and languages, also sometimes visiting speakers. And as I'll outline, Jennifer Wallis counts as both, because she's both a staff member here and also elsewhere within Imperial. So to summarize her career before we go into her fascinating talk, she's a teaching fellow in the history of science and medicine at the Centre for Languages, Culture, Communication, which is here. Also senior teaching fellow in medical humanities in the Faculty of Medicine here at Imperial. Various wonderful publications, including Investigating the Body in the Victoria Asylum, Anxious Times, Medicine and Modernity in 19th Century Britain, and co-edited Memory, Anniversaries and Mental Health and Historical Perspective 2023. This talk is based on a forthcoming chapter for an edited volume called Intoxicating Experiences, in progress with McGill Queen University Press as part of their Intoxicating Histories book series. Jen, over to you.
Thank you very much. So I hope everyone can hear me all right. I'll try and keep my eye on the chat in case you do have any problems. So I will get straight into it. So in early 2014, I joined a small team of postdoctoral researchers at the University of Oxford, and I need to share my slides for you. I was doing so well as well. And this project was titled Diseases of Modern Life, which was named after a book by a 19th century doctor, Benjamin Ward Richardson, and his book of this title in 1876. And in this book, he basically delineates the many complaints that seem to plague 19th century society: pollution, stress, overpressured education, alcoholism, drug use, and occupational disease. And each of us on the team chose two project themes to focus on. Mine were climate and addiction. And although I would leave this project before its completion, the years that I spent on it have proved quite formative in terms of my longer term research. So as Michael alluded to in his introduction, I've continued to work in the field of intoxication studies, such as it is, including actually introducing a history of intoxication module here at Imperial as part of the Horizons programme. So the historian E.H. Carr in What is History suggested that before we delve into any written history, we should first ask what bees the historian has in his bonnet. And after volunteering to lead the addiction strand of the project, I found myself reflecting on my own past in a more concerted way. So growing up, I had lived with an alcoholic guardian, and though this was something I would only gradually acquire labels and frameworks to understand, I would leave that environment when I was 15, moving towns and schools and losing contact with this person, who I'm going to call N throughout, until years later. For some time, I pondered whether this was interesting enough to write about, this odd intersection between research and personal history. And then early last year, I was asked to contribute to an edited volume that explored new perspectives in the history of intoxication. Would they accept a memoir type chapter, I asked, and they said yes. And the resulting chapter then draws connections between my historical research on 19th century drinking and my personal experiences of living with an alcoholic as a child and teenager. So I mix historical analysis with personal recollection to show the bits and pieces that inform the histories that I write, and to show how my professional life has often unconsciously been influenced by the personal. So more broadly, I suggest that historical accounts have the potential to reconfigure our past and present selves by providing insights via engaging with materials that are not related to ourselves, that cast new light on personal experiences. So how have memoir and history intersected? With the growing interest in working class and women's histories from the 1960s and 70s, the stories of those who had long been left out of published history began to be told. Yet, as Penny Summerfield observes in Histories of the Self, these social histories often had the unintended effect of obscuring the personal, collapsing individual stories into statistics. Historians began to draw upon life writing for their research and to engage in it themselves, as the self became a legitimate topic of scholarly inquiry. Some works told the author's own stories and interwove these with historical lives. Carolyn Steedman's Landscape for a Good Woman is a classic example of this and testament to how people use the past to tell the stories of their lives. And in this, she muses on her own multiple selves as an academic, as a working class woman, as a daughter, and uses these to interrogate psychoanalytic theory, patriarchal ideals, and the writing of working class and women's history. In the field of intoxication, the memoir has often taken the form of what we might call the addiction autobiography, sort of a natural extension of the confessions trope that tells a story of a moral fall followed by a redemption. And addiction autobiographies often attempt to reinforce an imagined boundary between the normal and the pathological, where addiction and sobriety are opposite ways of being in the world. Yet, many of these works often fail to contain addiction within a neat boundary, rather than proving the pathology of addiction as something located within the individual. The addiction autobiography repeatedly calls attention to the ways in which social, cultural, economic, and political forces shape addiction. And these socio-cultural forces are frequently recognized within the history of intoxication. So a good recent example is the work of Pam Locke and Dorota Diaz-Lewandowska on social norms and women's drinking practices. There's a really fascinating example by a scholar, Laura Troiano, who takes a really novel approach to the history of prohibition in New Jersey by creating fictionalized but historically informed fictional vignettes. And as Troiano puts it, writing creatively about history allows her to question, quote, why I cannot use I in my work, even though it has me all over it, end quote, as well as offering the possibility of filling gaps in her research that cannot be filled in any other way. The gaps in my own research are the motivations behind my consistent choices to focus attention on those areas of life that have been othered in some way. And within intoxication studies, I struggled to find many examples of scholars discussing their interactions with source materials or their roots into the field. And that is absolutely not to say that I think scholars should do this, but rather that the silences as well as the noises of our research warrants investigation. If we look to recent history of psychiatry scholarship, there are several examples of academics melding the personal and the historical. So to mention just one, Barbara Taylor's absolutely brilliant book, The Last Asylum, combines her experience of a stay in Frian Barnett's psychiatric hospital with a broader overview of asylum history, and particularly in the context of the closure of many asylums in the era of deinstitutionalization. In an earlier account of her stay at Frian, Taylor recounts one day where her friend, the historian Raphael Samuel, comes to visit her. And she says, he looked around the vast ward with undisguised fascination and embraced me. Darling Barbara, what a privilege for you as a historian to be present at the demise of one of the last great Victorian institutions. I was annoyed and amused, but he was right, of course. And Taylor's anecdote, I think, nicely illustrates the unusual position within which a historian may find themselves, simultaneously experiencing and analysing their field. So I have a very vivid memory, for instance, of being on a panel at a drinking studies conference during the Diseases Project, where I did a short talk about the facilitation of secret drinking via fashion and accessories. And this linked supposedly jerky gift ideas like handbags with hidden wine bladders to historical accounts of women hiding alcohol about their person. And in the Q&A, it was suggested by one commentator that I was making too much of products like the Porto Vino bag, which was surely, they said, simply a convenience for people to take wine on picnics. I was, it was implied, missing the joke. And my response was far from nuanced, as I found myself blurting out somewhat angrily that actually, no, I disagreed, because I had grown up with an alcoholic who hid alcohol, and I could see very well how such items might support an addiction. And in explaining my angle, it felt as though I was breaking the rules of scholarly debates by introducing personal experience into the conversation. The performance of academic discourse was not done like this, not with personal confessionals that made the audience shift in their chairs and look away. Yet, we consistently encourage critical reflection in academic work. Our personal experiences are an inescapable part of understanding why we are captivated by particular sources or topics, how we come to tell the stories that we tell, and how we reflect on the work that we produce. Hilary Mantel, in her memoir, Giving Up the Ghost, which is also absolutely brilliant, I really recommend this if you've not read it, says, I used to think autobiography was a form of weakness, and perhaps I still do. But I also think that if you're weak, it's childish to pretend to be strong. And so in writing the chapter for the edited volume, I struggled with the sense of performing myself in some way. My first attempts were very guarded, written for an imagined audience who would question and interrogate me, and who might now judge my other academic work with a warier eye. But the past we have lived endures in us in more ways than we understand. And to imagine that historical writing is in no way shaped by these past lives is, I think, disingenuous. The self-performance of the historian seems to me a vital part of the stories I am telling and wish to tell. And the historian's training in source analysis, in seeing multiple sides to a story, is also, it seems, rather suited to memoir. And so sitting at my desk back in Oxford in 2014 and tasked with writing something, anything, on the theme of addiction, the history of alcohol in the 19th century seemed to offer endless possibilities. Patent medicines containing alcohol, alcohol in fiction, the rise of the purpose-built pub. And the early stages of my research seemed even messier than they normally were as I leafed through bound volumes of temperance tracts, issues of the British Women's Temperance Journal, and things like the Quarterly Journal of Inebriety. And in this work, I began to see repeated references to secret drinking in newspapers and periodicals. And this secret drinking was blamed on a variety of factors, including the ability of grocers to sell alcohol following the 1860 Refreshment Houses Act, and also sometimes the careless prescription of alcohol by doctors, which set up a habit. Some articles that I came across suggested women were becoming particularly skilled in the art of subterfuge and using elaborate accessories to conceal alcohol. The Temperance Chronicle in 1894 listed some of these. A fake bunch of grapes, each hollow and filled with brandy, a fan with a flask concealed in the handle. On the diseases team, we sat around the table at one of our fortnightly meetings and giggled at these fantastical contrivances. But there is something about them, however ridiculous, that I find troubling, and I cannot find the words to articulate it. Sometimes it is only much later that you begin to see what drew you to a particular historical topic. So if you asked me to recall the smellscape of the 1990s, it would be marked by the sharp tang of Body Shop Dewberry body spray, which excitement to all of us who grew up at a certain period has, I see, just been reintroduced, and the sickliness of Special Brew lager. The gold cans of Special Brew were a familiar sight in our house, sometimes alternating with the black and gold cans of Kestrel Super Strength lager. Cans could be found in unexpected places, inside the cake tin that sat on the highest kitchen shelf, or in the underbed drawers in my parents' bedroom. When challenged on their existence, N would say they were a gift from our neighbour, a treat for someone who had a hard and thankless life. The idea of our elderly neighbour, a Margaret Rutherford type with a Yorkshire Terrier, going to the shops to procure a 4-pack of Special Brew as a gift was as implausible as it was incongruous. But N and I played on one another's weaknesses. I knew that to invoke sickness or injury of some kind was the only means to avoid school. And as our house didn't have a telephone, also a fairly secure fabrication with little risk of being found out. On those days when I couldn't feign a believable illness, I would set out in my school uniform, spend an hour reading in the waste ground behind our house, then return with the story that I'd become so ill as to be sent home. When this mild subterfuge became untenable, I resorted to more extreme measures, discovering that repeatedly scratching the skin to remove the top layer produced a mark convincingly like a burn that could be blamed on a Bunsen burner. And if you're interested in the history of kind of personal reflections on self-harm, I really recommend Sarah Cheney's work. She's done some fantastic pieces. Illness was a shared language in our house, and all the more resonant if one could blame someone else for its appearance, the negligent science teacher, the abandoning partner. I often wonder what N thought of their own drinking, whether it was considered analytically like a set of accounts, or stuffed down deep, dark, as deep as it would go, and conscientiously dismissed. In my hometown of Bradford, alcohol seemed relatively unproblematic in any case. During my time at school, we were frequently warned of the dangers of drugs, but rarely alcohol. I was perversely fascinated by the horrors of glue sniffing, something of an epidemic in 1980s Britain, and a regular topic of ominous school assemblies. The waste ground opposite our house was a frequent haunt of young boys who would emerge furtive, clutching plastic bags that they plunged into their pockets before weaving drunkenly down the road. Alcohol, as portrayed by the mainstream press of the time, seemed glamorous in comparison. It was an era of brightly branded alcopops and savvy marketing to women, like the early 1990s adverts for Boddingtons. The ladettes of the tabloids were airbrushed with the sheen of respectability. To be a tipsy Radio 1 DJ who courted the paparazzi while holding a bottle of Jack Daniels was not the same as drinking cheap cider in a bus stop in a Northern Council estate. There was one woman, though, who brought a degree of celebrity to Buttershaw, the area of Bradford where I lived. Andrea Dunbar, the playwright behind Rita Sue and Bob 2, which was made into a film in 1987, and also the writer of the lesser-known The Arbor, which brought her to widespread initial attention when it was staged in London in 1980. And it is impossible to read about Dunbar without quickly finding out about her untimely death at the age of 29, which was often said to have occurred in the Beacon pub on the Buttershaw estate, where she was a regular drinker. That she in fact died in Bradford Royal Infirmary is, it seems, a minor detail left out unless it disrupted the Dunbar myth. Growing up in the area, the Dunbar name was a familiar one, as I went to school with many members of her extended family. But only later in life did I fully appreciate the extent of the mythology that had grown up around her in the decades since her death in 1990, and how that mythology extended to Buttershaw and its residents. In her fictionalized novel about Dunbar's life, but based very much on her life, Black Teeth and a Brilliant Smile, Adele Stripe describes Buttershaw in bleak terms. It is a place of boarded up windows, of burnt out cars, where stray dogs roam the streets at the edges of a city haunted by the shadow of the Yorkshire Ripper. Reading the novel, written by a northerner, yes, but not one who had lived in Buttershaw, I am reminded of Seth Coburn's slumming tourists, who mingled good intentions and blinkered prejudices that informed their vision of the poor and of themselves as they toured urban districts with philanthropic zeal. Stripe's novel forces me to think about my own intentions and responsibilities in writing memoir. I do not want to add to the mythology of the gritty, poverty-stricken Northern Council estate that so entranced the spectators of Dunbar's life. But nor do I want to claim that life there was uncommonly rosy. Buttershaw seemed to generate tragic female figures. In 1995, a pupil from our school, Nabantu Zaini, was found dead on moorland in Bingley, and the case remains unsolved. For the newspapers, the story was as much about Bradford's council estates as it was about 15-year-old Nabantu, prompting our headmaster to write to the Independent and criticise their throwaway description of his school as a housing estate comprehensive. The names of Dunbar and Nabantu were whispered as cautionary tales, urban myths, their supposed transgressions inseparable from the locale in which they lived. I return to myth and rumour repeatedly in my work on the Diseases Project, chasing the threads about women's drinking that are scattered liberally through late Victorian newspapers and periodicals. I feel I am chasing shadows. Some take more concrete form than others, like the figure of Jane Cakebread, who was arrested for drunk and disorderly behaviour on more than 100 occasions. A 1904 article by Robert Jones, the superintendent of the asylum where Jane eventually died, described her as having achieved something close to immortality on account of her notoriety. According to him, Jane courted publicity, reading cuttings or extracts about herself in the police news, and yet he also expressed his distaste for those who had, he said, given her drink in order to hear her talk and to see the fireworks. I am reminded of anecdotes about Dunbar and the Beacon, with fellow drinkers at one moment keen to encourage Dunbar's fiery temper by buying her drinks, at another shunning her on account of her new status as a playwright. Alongside the salaciously reported cases of people like Jane Cakebread, there were reams of unnamed, faceless women for whom journalists crafted whole lives, motivations, and desires. And for the first time in my life, I find I am not actually enjoying the work of being a historian. I struggle for weeks with how to articulate my conclusions to a chapter about secret drinking, how to write a history of something that was by definition invisible. I repeatedly encountered the name of Norman Shanks Kerr, a Scottish physician who founded the Society for the Study and Cure of Inebriety in 1884. Women figured prominently in Kerr's writings. In an 1880 lecture on female intemperance, Kerr declared that never in recorded history had women drunk to the extent that they did in late 19th century Britain. He cited police statistics that suggested an alarming increase in the numbers arrested for public drunkenness. In Swansea, this was a supposed increase of 180% between 1872 and 84. Amongst the anecdotes that he offered from his own experience was the case of a woman who had died from drinking, her husband suspecting nothing, as she had trained her daughter to smuggle alcohol into the house. Women from all walks of life, he claimed, were being ruined by illicit alcohol consumption behind closed doors or shamelessly in pubs, and it was the job of the implicitly male doctor to spot it. The telltale signs were not clinical necessarily, but rather a divergence from feminine ideals. The intemperate woman was slovenly, neglecting her appearance, her household duties, and her children. The only remedy for the evil was abstinence. In Kerr's worldview, women were powerless to resist the temptations of pubs, grocers, medicinal pick-me-ups. Kerr's explanation was neat and one-dimensional, and I both envied and scorned his confidence in such black and white views of the world, that people were liars or truth-tellers, good or bad. To Kerr, alcohol was the boundary between the good and the depraved woman, with no shades of grey in between, and I recoiled from his lazy generalisations. Yet hadn't I, more than once, fallen into the trap of doing a very similar thing, in reading every instance of alcoholism that I met through the lens of N, and reading them all as one amorphous type. In the process of researching Victorian drinking, I began to question my own established narratives and memories, to see alternate explanations for behaviours I had once dismissed as straightforwardly selfish. Kerr could not seem to recognise the pressures of 19th century womanhood, repeated childbearing, invented ideals of domesticity, and I found this exasperating. And the broader 20th century structuring social forces I was unable to appreciate as a child, like the confining boundaries of domesticity or the pressures of parenting, are clearer now and sometimes so blindingly obvious I cannot understand how I didn't see them. I am not sure how clearly or sympathetically I would have seen them had I not immersed myself in historical materials that forced me to consider lives that were very similar to N's. Being comfortably separated from my experience by over 100 years, historical materials made it safe to contemplate topics in detail and to formulate new interpretations of my own stories. And out of that reconfiguration also emerged positive memories that had in fact been lost to the passage of time, of things like butterscotch flavoured Angel Delight, of the flowery pages of a Biro recipe book, of N's apologetic gift of a small wooden box for my birthday when it was all that we could be afforded. They are testament to the unreliability of memory and the ability of the mind to bury that which it does not wish to consider just yet. Sometimes the good memories involve alcohol, like the school holiday visits to a pub where N would buy me a ham sandwich and crisps, their own lunch accompanied by pints of cider. To again quote Mantell, the story of my own childhood is a complicated sentence that I am always trying to finish. Is writing this chapter then a finishing point or a full stop? What has been the purpose of it? To garner sympathy, to assert my class background, to lay to rest my own childhood demons? I think it is easier to categorically say what it is not. It is not an indictment or intended as an expose. I do not believe that all addictions or drink-fueled transgressions deserve to be made public, or that there is some moral high ground to be gained in doing so. I have been careful to protect the identities of the people I discuss whose names are not already known. And secrecy can be liberating as well as damaging. It is only by masking aspects of this story that I am able to tell it, with the telling itself a kind of liberation. And the ability to tell it in my own words, how I wish to tell it, is of course a privilege. And the right to privacy has been unequally distributed historically. It has been the better off who have been afforded the privilege of keeping their activities secret, while the working and labouring classes have been subject to intrusion, touristic slumming and expose. It is impossible for me as a historian to view the continued fictionalised iterations of Dunbar's life, for example, apart from this historical framing. Telling a story like hers or Jane Cakebread's or N's will always involve a calculation of the potential benefits and losses. What do they lose in the telling, and what do we as historians and readers gain, and should we? In late 2024, I returned to Buttershaw and my childhood home for the first time in about 25 years. And in that strange Alice in Wonderlandish trick that our adult minds play on us, everything seemed smaller than I remembered it. The house seemed to be consuming itself from the inside out like a laboured Gothic cliché. The garden wall was held up by a mound of rubbish, and black mould covered the walls inside. N reacted to the presence of myself and my husband with a dulled enthusiasm, almost as though we had returned from a month's holiday rather than stepped across the threshold of a house that I had lived in over 2 decades ago. I recognised every piece of furniture, much of it dilapidated and covered in a film of dust. On the wall was a black and white photograph, curled at the edges but unmoved from where it had been stuck 30 or 40 years before. The only door in the house that was closed was that to my childhood bedroom, and on it at eye level remained the familiar ceramic plaque, silently insisting that this was Jennifer's room. The retrospective double vision of the historian is nicely described by Jeremy Popkin. We have the privilege of knowing what the actors in the past thought they were doing, or at least we think we do, and what actually happened as a result of their actions. In looking at that rectangle of porcelain, I had the uncanny feeling of observing myself as though I was standing outside myself and seeing multiple selves reflected back. Who was the person who had lived in that room, looked through those curtains and picked up those paperbacks? What would I have thought, would I have ever thought, about standing here so many years later, mutely taking in all that had changed and not changed in the interim? The preserved in aspic atmosphere of the house made it feel like I was haunting my past life, coldly reassessing it with an academic eye for what it said about the present me and all the versions in between. In Helen M. Buss's reading of Steedman's Landscape for a Good Woman, she contrasts her initial admiration of Steedman's narrative with her discomfort on rereading the book several years later. Buss's new role as a mother reconfigures her reading of Steedman's text, and she describes her surprise at finding that she finds some women's texts offensive and is unable to maintain an academic objectivity. I have a similar feeling when reading Strype's work, which sits uneasily with me on account of the way it appears to revel in the details of deprivation. Yet I have no doubt that a relative of Dunbar's might hear my story and be equally offended by my incorporation of her story into mine and accuse me of the very same thing. Of course, my personal experience provides little new insight into 19th century drinking habits, and here you might rightly ask, then so what? Rather than leading to new historical insights though, what I wish to emphasise is how historical sources led me to look at my own history in new ways and to encourage me to write history in new ways. Having some form of personal investment in the historical narratives one crafts does not mean such work is less rigorous. The anxiety to ensure a reliable historical account may lead to more scrutiny of one's sources and interpretations. Now, reading the morally outraged accounts of commentators like Norman Kerr, I wonder why it is that I feel such empathy for these faceless women. And I remind myself that the socioeconomic pressures on them, which I have come to understand through years of research and writing, are a version of the same pressures that weighed on N. Sometimes it is easier to understand someone's pain by proxy. Memoir can only ever be one person's truth, however, and this will always be a partial history. N does not get to tell their story here, and I am conscious that my own interpretation is dependent on my immediate context. Indeed, what is not in that chapter, which is currently in peer review, is the coda of just the last few weeks. N was admitted to hospital with alcohol-related illness and not allowed home until their house was cleaned. And I returned to the house again 3 weeks ago, sifting through special brew cans and childhood memories. And this is when most of the photos that you've seen were taken. And in a weird synchronicity, literally as I am giving this talk, there is a group of cleaners in that house cleaning it. So however you have received this story, I hope it demonstrates the value in openly acknowledging the interplay between the personal and the historical, if people want to do so and are comfortable doing so, and in recognising that our social and ideological positions in the present can both modify and be modified by the evidence of the past. And I will stop there, Michael. And you haven't shouted at me, so I think I'm on time.
It's all good. No, I'll go here. Thank you so much, Jen. Very thought-provoking. I'm sure we got lots of questions.
Oh.
So do I. But is there anyone online? Paul, do you have it's the only computer we're using?
Yes.
Okay. So I need to look at what's going on here as well. Okay, if anyone online has got questions, please feel free to put your hand up or in the chat. I'm also monitoring the room. Who would like to start us off? Chris Millard. Chris, you can either turn off your mic or put a text in. It's up to you. Over to you.
Hello. Hi, Jen. Thanks for that. That was really, really brilliant. I'm really interested in how these personal academic narratives have their own sort of logic to them. I'm struck by the way your narrative, in a way, mirrors Carolyn Steedman's in both the way it's based in a particular sort of class identity, but also it sort of pivots on an unsatisfying reunion with the central person at the end or near the end. And I think one of the things I wanted to ask is all these tropes, like Adam Phillips has said, like the genres make their own claims on us and they speak on our behalf. And there is a growing sort of genre of academic personal writing, and this conflicts with the idea that our experiences are unique, and we're not, talking in a generic way, but a unique one. And I wonder, like, as I'm also, as you know, someone who's sort of trying to do this similar things, should we be fighting that and sort of being very aware of the generic aspects even of our very unique experiences? Should we be managing it in a different way? I'm just interested in sort of being self-conscious as so many aspects, and should we be self-consciously sort of pushing back on conventions of genre, or how do you see that?
Thank you, Chris, and thank you so much for coming. It's brilliant that you're here, and it's also refreshing that you could extract some form of narrative logic from it, because that was one of the worries, that actually how this is the first time I've ever written anything like this, and it was, to me, it seemed like there were logical connections, but how far other people are able to appreciate those logical connections was less certain, I think. And that's probably why I have fallen very much into the convention that you describe, of kind of, that is very influenced by Steedman's narrative and other people's narratives as well, where you are positioning yourself as a certain kind of writer and a certain kind of observer with things to say. And I think it is important that we break out of those narratives. How we do is a different question. I really loved the paper that I mentioned by Laura Troiano, who had done ample historical research. It wasn't necessarily a personal story, it was more the structure that I was struck by in her work, where she writes these fictional vignettes that are absolutely rooted in historical accuracy, but are telling the story in a very different way. And I fell a little bit in love with that, but I felt that was too much just at this point, at being the first attempt at writing this. But maybe in the future, I may go on to do something like that. But I agree, I think we are in danger of kind of falling into this almost like it always feels uncomfortably slightly confessional.
Thanks, Jen. Who would like to go next? Do we have more?
Thank you to my husband for his message in the chat.
Well done, Jason. Nice to see you again. I've got a historical question and a kind of memoir, autobiography, history question. Should we do the easy one first?
Yeah, please.
The history one. So, late 19th century. The thing I'm writing about myself is this. There's a lot of there's very well known studies of poverty at the time, maps and all these kind of new ways of exploring poverty. And where I'm looking at is this notion that the British workforce has become, or always was. They use the word inefficient a lot, efficiency, this notion of it. And I'm just wondering, and I was looking at workers and mines and stuff like that, but the idea of the US, the Germans were powerful, searing forward in history, and the British were sluggish. And one study said half or a third as productive or as efficient as the American workforce. Is there some comparative narrative at the time about British women who you're studying compared to other countries? If so, why?
British women, what, in terms of drinking?
Yeah.
There is that narrative, but then I wonder how far, and I mean, I don't know if Pam is in this meeting, but she's worked really extensively on British and Polish representations of women's drinking in a similar period. And I feel like every country has its own little panic about this. In 1892 in Britain, the Telegraph publishes a big article that makes a lot of noise called Britain's National Shame, Women's Drinking. And there is this idea that women in particular are somehow more prey to the temptations of drinking, which I mentioned a couple. A lot of them are interestingly tied to urban space. The idea that women are venturing out into urban space more, that the city is giving them new opportunities, like flashy new department stores that have cafes in them, some of which are licensed. Yes. Yeah. Although when William Whiteley applies for a license for Whiteley's department store, he's refused it, not on the grounds of the license, because the judge said something like he has his finger in too many pies already. But there's lots of these opportunities for women to do this, and there's a real worry, I think, that now that men are maybe venturing further away from the home to work, that some kind of checking influence is missing, and that women will be using their hours on their own at home. How do they fill those hours? They fill them with drinking in some way. So I think there is a peculiarly British panic about it.
Thank you. Yeah, no, nothing like a good sort of survey to come out and shock the public. We didn't know about this phenomenon, but now we've got some statistics. Now we do.
But they didn't, because it was secret. So this was a wonderful story. You could go with it forever, because it was just as infinite as you chose for it to be.
Thanks, Jen. So, any more questions, or I'm going to go on with my harder one. Claudia has got you the next question. Claudia, over to you.
Hi, thank you so much. That was really interesting. I guess I've literally just been steeped in reading Elena Ferrante's novels that are sort of set in Naples and sort of chart these two kind of main characters from the 50s all the way until the 90s, actually also into the 2000s, and kind of like through that's sort of like an amazing example of the power of the novel and how you can follow these characters and that kind of thing. And then I guess the question comes from, I'm always kind of questioning, I have all these different potential avenues in which to discuss certain things that I'm interested in, and it might be through an essay, or it might be through a painting, or it might be, like you make choices about why you've chosen a particular kind of output mode. And so I just wondered if you had anything to say. It's not really a question, but what your thoughts are on why you're taking this kind of literary way, or like personal reflections, into academia. I think it's a really interesting thing to do, but yeah, just any thoughts that you might have on that.
Thank you, Claudia. Yeah, so I mean, one thing I had been quite struck by was some of the work in history of psychiatry that I'd engaged with. So I mentioned Barbara Taylor, but Sarah Cheney's work as well has been really quite influential. Chris, who's also in the meeting, is also working in this kind of area. And it felt like it was something that, it always felt like a bit of my work in the history of alcohol that was important somehow, but there wasn't an obvious way to insert it in a traditional, if you like, academic paper, and to academize it, if you like. And I sort of didn't want to do that either. And I think I also have to credit Imperial a little bit, actually, and the people that I work with for inspiring me to do different things with my research. So I work with the wonderful Giskin Day, who many of you will know in this room, and she really kind of introduced me to the idea of how things don't always have to be an academic paper or a monograph. And so the last thing that I kind of published was actually a zine. I'd written an article that I wasn't particularly happy with where the journal wanted it to go, and I'm lucky enough not to be nagged about what my ref submissions are. So I just turned it into a zine that allowed me to use lots of visuals at the same time. And I think that has probably made me more open to doing things in a different way. It's not to say that I've abandoned the traditional way. So I'm very much in my head, I've got a proper journal article that desperately needs finishing, that's half in my head and half on some paper. But I think I quite like the sense of having a balance in it. Very rambling answer, sorry, Claudia.
Thank you. That was a question from Claudia Cannon, one of our fine science communication MSc graduates. Michael Paraskos, next question, please.
Thank you. Wonderful. I'm interested in your views on the different genres that one can take outside of something called academic writing. You've gone from something, from what I understand, that is kind of memoir, is kind of drawing on your personal experience. But does that still leave out kind of the creative side of alternative writing? Now, I myself, got Vicky here as well, I mean, I come out of an art school tradition where talking about these kinds of things through creative processes is far more common.
Yeah.
It's unusual for me because I'm an art historian in that background, so it's not so common for me, but the jump wasn't so great. And I'm just wondering whether these are things you personally want to sort of explore further, but also is that still a blind spot in university academia towards a more creative output of research?
I would be really interested in doing that personally. I'm very kind of lucky to have good mentors. So my husband, who's on the call as well, is an artist. So it's like I've got somebody I can bounce ideas off. I would dearly love to write fiction at some point. It's a huge learning curve, as I've discovered in my very short forays into trying to write short stories, that it's horrendously difficult when you are used to writing academic work. But I think I would very much be open to that kind of thing. And I loved the process of making a zine as well. I would quite like to do that again for something. I feel like, well, I'm in the Faculty of Medicine primarily, and before that I've been in very kind of traditional history departments. So there's never, in my own experience, been particular room or role modelling for that kind of work to be done as an output. I feel like the people who are most able to say something about that are probably in this room, and who have probably know a lot about that and actually how you go about doing that. But it does seem like it's like, I don't know, the move into memoir seems like that's a way forward, like that's a little bit of a step in allowing that. But then I wonder how far how well someone would react to me kind of offering a completely fictionalized version of something as saying something about the history of intoxication, for instance. So it's a really interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, and it's particularly acute perhaps in Imperial, because obviously it's a science institution. So if we had a humanities faculty that's teaching degree courses in English or creative writing, it would be perhaps more familiar. But it's a curious thing in this environment. But I mean, like you, it's also a curious thing that because it's not central, it's perhaps a little more tolerated in a way, or acceptable.
Yeah, I think that's true. And actually, when I moved to Imperial from Queen Mary, it was a very different situation where suddenly I'm a teaching only contract basically, and nobody is saying, what are you going to publish this year? And at first I felt slightly crestfallen like that, like, oh, nobody cares what I'm doing. And now I think it's absolutely brilliant because nobody cares what I'm doing. And nobody, I can do a zine as a research output, and that's fine. And it's read by very different people, and it's led me to very different conferences and meeting different groups of people than I would have had I done it as I would normally have done it.
It also gives you a chance to experiment with stuff that other people may not be able to, and then they like to draw on that from experience. Yeah. Chris Miller's back. Over to you, Chris.
Yeah, sorry if anyone else wants to speak. I don't like hog questions. Building on the last question actually about sort of discipline, because genre is one thing and discipline is another. And having written something with an artist who basically started off by going, well, how on earth would you produce something that wasn't to do with your personal experience? And I sort of had to explain to them sort of very slowly that historians hate this a lot of the time. Like, and I wonder if you could, your experience, I guess, of being trained as a historian in that particular discipline, it's curiously inhospitable to some of this, the people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. And but there's no reason why it should be. Like, anthropology and sociology are much more hospitable as disciplines, as academic disciplines, to reflexivity and reflection and participant observation and analysis of one's own presence in one's academic research. History, like, it just does not have anywhere near that amount of engagement or reflection. And I wonder, from one historian to another, what the hell with our discipline?
Yeah, it's an interesting. I feel like, Chris, next time I see you, this will be a long, 3-hour-long conversation. When I think back to kind of being a historian at undergrad and master's level and so on, I suppose it's in contrast to maybe anthropology or sociology, it's perhaps much more archive-based in a sense, and you're much more kind of searching for concrete evidence in places that you can back things up with, and being told that you need to have an objective narrative that, we still advise students, well, I don't, but often my teachers would say, don't write I in a history essay. It's not your opinion. Whereas I think things have moved on quite a bit now, where lots of historians do that, and it's understood that the historian is working with materials that they have, yes, they've found through a very rigorous process, but they're also working through things that are a result of their own interest and their own topic interest. And so there is that degree of personality in it. But it's interesting that, if I look back to people who taught me history, and they would say, you've got to be objective, you've got to, don't say I, you've got to not be biased, you've got to make sure all these sources are properly accounted for. And yet, even now, when if I say I'm a historian, some people from STEM backgrounds, their word to describe history is subjective. And there is still an idea amongst some STEM contingents that history is basically fiction, that you are cherry picking what you want to write. I remember vividly talking to a clinician some years ago, and they said, oh, it must be wonderful being a historian because you can just write what you want. And I thought, well, it's not quite like that. So again, I think if we delved into this, there's probably all sorts of little quirks of historical training that explain why we've got to this point where we think there's not a space for this. But I do think it has switched around quite a lot in the last maybe 10, 15 years.
Thank you. More points. We've got 7 minutes left. Okay, so I have a question, Jen. So what I found about historians, I find if you look at people's work and corpus of their career, you could normally tell a lot about their personal life, having never met them, which is a historian skill, right? You can look at 3 different things and go. So my question for you, you've explained the centrality of certain kind of medical topics, but why the Victorian period? Your entire oeuvre misses out the 20th century. I'm wondering why.
Primarily, I was thinking about this recently. Yeah. It's because when I was a child, I was to get us out of the house, away from the drinking behaviour, I was taken to almost every possible museum that was in the local area. And many of those were focused on the 19th century. Bradford Industrial Museum, formative place when I was growing up. And I think I felt very comfortable and very more connected to that era purely because of where I'd been taken when I was a child.
Yeah. I did not expect you to say that. That was a great answer.
Did you think there was going to be a deeper theoretical?
I didn't know what you were going to say. That's why I know. It was a great answer. Thank you, Jen. Anyone got any final points? Yeah, Catherine, yeah.
I really
really enjoyed that talk. It's extremely interesting.
Thank you.
This is
Catherine.
Catherine Knight.
It was a great talk. And I was interested in the sort of intersection of these women who drink always being working class. Are there any women who drink who are not working class in history?
Oh,
and do they
definitely.
get written about?
Yeah, they did. And when there was this panic about secret drinking, it was interesting that there were very specific types of drinker according to class, but all women were basically at risk of this. So the upper class equivalent was the elite lady who is gadding about in society, going to London season, society balls and drinking lots of champagne. There was a brief panic about perfume drinking in the 1890s. This idea that well-off ladies who were too ashamed to be seen drinking were knocking back their perfume in their bedrooms, which seems slightly, well, who knows, but less of the ones that seemed as plausible as some of the others. But it's kind of all women, but in different ways. In that the working class women are fairly shameless and they just they go around. They don't go to the pub, they're going and they're drinking with their neighbours and they're kind of having a collective informal drinking group. Or the middle classes are the women who are at home suddenly, they're in charge of a nice household, and they've maybe got their husband's checking account to go and buy things from the grocers, and they put on dinner parties for their friends, so they have a wine cellar suddenly. It's all a bit, if you've read The Diary of a Nobody, it's very much like that kind of like the dark side of that idea. And the elites are kind of indulging in it in a very permitted way, because that part of their job is to socialize. So that's the very broad, very kind of crude way of splitting up those groups.
Yeah, and it's bad for all women.
Yeah. There's at no point does Norman Kerr think that elite ladies might be all right with it. There's particular groups of people as well, like nurses are often said to be particular problems.
Wow.
And this is in contrast to the alleged unlocking of troubled genius in men, particularly elite ones.
Yes.
Writers, all kinds of people that are alleged, Ernest Hemingway types.
Yeah, I mean, there's still worry about men's drinking, but it's not quite to the state of, it's obviously, women were expected to be the moral guardians of the nation, and as soon as they've all fallen, then it's the end of everything.
You got a point.
There was one thing I just wanted to ask you.
Final question, everyone.
You talked about accessibility and said go to cafes and things. The thing that always strikes me is, especially when you look at council estates that were built maybe in the 30s onwards, they all have those little rows of shops.
Yes.
And you can, in those little rows of shops, you can buy little miniatures and And I just wondered, do you think that was something that kind of exasperated drinking, or?
That's interesting. I don't know if anyone's written about that, and I should look into it. I'm not sure that, I mean, where I grew up, drinking was very public in the sense that there wasn't necessarily a great shame about it. That, if you were walking back from the shop with your 2-litre bottle of cider, nobody's going to bat an eyelid. So miniatures were kind of did you have some extra money that week? Because that's a bit much to be drinking miniatures. But yeah, those shops are interesting. And I think there's a larger project, historical project, not necessarily about drinking, but just about estates and provisions, because it's very weird how, and maybe it is from some kind of fear of antisocial behaviour, that lots of new housing estates have no shops at all on them, which I find very bizarre.
Yes, and it's sort of 30s to maybe 70s that they were doing that, but they don't do it now, do they? So new builds definitely don't.
No, they don't. No, and Buttershaw has still got quite a long parade of shops in it.
Yeah. I was thinking about where there's an estate in Maidstone, and that made me think of that. And you see people coming out with the miniatures.
Yeah.
All right, we've got 1 minute left. Any final burning points? Vicky, make it quick, please.
Thank you for your talk. It was really
Microphone.
interesting. I'm an artist, and what I was starting to get a very kind of visual sort of impression of your home and its interior, and you kept
talking about cleanliness a lot, you know, how it had to be cleaned. And I was just wondering how much of that is in your book, this idea of dirt and a sort of sense that there's no sense of organisation.
It isn't too much, actually. It's not. I probably only mentioned it more today because it's more of the coda to it. Is that in the last month it's been, you know, it's become an issue with social care that it has to be cleaned. But yeah, certainly, it's when I think about the experience of being there, it is very much linked to kind of it not being cleaned, it being quite barren, quite sparse, and almost everything else being unimportant, but alcohol being centrally important in the house. And go on, sorry.
There is an artist, a photographer who you might want to have a look at called Richard Billingham. Billingham, yeah, and he's done a whole. He's a photographer, and he's done a whole suite of works on intoxication, his own experience, because his father was an alcoholic, and a lot of his work is focused on the interior of his home.
Oh, interesting. Thank you. Yeah, I'll definitely look that up. Thank you.
And he's had big exhibitions at Tate, all about intoxication and alcoholism and families.
Oh, right.
Oh, thank you, Lee. Well, on that note, thank you to everyone in the audience. Thank you for those online. Thank you for those who are watching this on YouTube after the fact. And especially thank you to Dr. Jennifer Wallis.